Good morning, period A. The bell is about to ring, so you need to stop playing around, take out something to write with, and start working on the Do Now assignment that I've put up on the board. Don't forget to read the question twice before you try to answer it. Don't forget to write in complete sentences, otherwise I'll take off points. Deshawn, you need to take out something to write with. Kendra, if I hear your voice again, I'm going to write you a detention. This was my voice 17 years ago, on a typical morning at the Urban Public Charter School where I began my teaching career. Imagine it for a moment. First, there was me, a white girl from the suburbs, fresh out of the Ivy League, 22 years old, and 5'1" in heels. Then there were my students, 17-year-olds from Southeast DC, most of them Black, all of them impacted by intergenerational poverty. We could have learned something from each other. For my part, I was painfully clueless when it came to race and racism, but I was genuinely passionate when it came to literature and literacy. For my students' part, they knew more than anyone ever should about America's racial caste system, but many of them had been so poorly served by the local schools that they could barely read. So we could have learned something from each other, but we didn't. At least they didn't learn much from me. The problem was that I and my school and the field made a lot of mistakes when it came to engaging with urban youth. It was 2005. The idea of broken windows policing had gained popularity in the 90s, and in the early 2000s, a similar approach to discipline gained traction in schools like mine. The mantra of this approach was, sweat the small stuff, and it meant taking a stance of control and mistrust toward children of color. Metal detectors at the front doors of our school. Discipline staff patrolling the hallways at all times. Detentions doled out for things as small as an untucked shirt or an eye roll. My school's policy was also deeply influenced by the 2001 No Child Left Behind Act. No Child Left Behind intended to disrupt predictable patterns of educational success and failure that play out along racial and socioeconomic lines. It was a worthy intention. In reality, though, for schools like mine, No Child Left Behind was actually about testing. Lots and lots of testing. Every Sunday night, I was required to turn in my weekly lesson plans with test-aligned assessments and test-aligned standards spelled out for each day. My lessons themselves focused on test-aligned skills that I made my students practice over and over again out of context, finding and fixing comma splices, citing evidence to support a claim, find the main idea, find the main idea, find the main idea. We had gotten ourselves into the centuries-old business of trying to control Black bodies and Black minds, rebranded under a shiny new millennium-era name, No Excuses Schooling. It wasn't all bad. As I gained experience as a teacher, there were some days, maybe even weeks, when my students and I engaged together in something that resembled powerful learning. Like the time when we studied Shakespeare's sonnets and then used what we learned to write and perform our own. Or the time when we studied the protest literature of South Africa in student-led book clubs. Rising test scores suggested that some of my students were, in fact, becoming stronger readers and writers, at least in the ways that the tests could measure. As a number of brilliant scholars have argued, however, No Excuses Schooling was a painful and harmful game. Chris Emdin likens it to a power drill, an instrument of brute force. Ileana Horn calls it carceral schooling, meaning it echoes what happens in prisons. Bettina Love skips the niceties and calls it spirit murdering. I don't know what I can say about these descriptions except that they're right. I might have had some good days with my students, I did. But on the whole, my teaching was profoundly limited and limiting. I saw my students' cultures and identities and ways of being as a problem. And I spent all of my time obsessing over how I could fill them up with college knowledge and other skills that they might need in their futures. Rarely did I spend any time thinking about who they were, what they cared about, what they had to offer, and what might serve them in the present. All of this was made worse by the fact that I had a bad case of white fragility. Even the simplest of descriptions I could have used to paint a picture of my classroom, I was white, my students were black, lay beyond my comfort zone. I solved this problem by deciding that it would be unprofessional of me to talk with my students about myself. And of course, it would be unprofessional of me to ask my students about themselves as well. After 4 years in the classroom, I knew that something was wrong. My students weren't thriving. I wasn't thriving either. I had begun to get migraine headaches almost every time I walked through the school's double doors. And so I did what overprivileged 20-somethings often do when they're at loose ends. I applied to grad school. 12 months later, I met Jal Mehta. He was a junior professor of education at Harvard, and I was a first-year doctoral student. We were at very different points in our careers, but we quickly realized that we had a lot in common, in particular, a belief that something about the No Child Left Behind era had gone wrong. So, as academics do, we decided to start a research project together. At the time, we called it the Good Schools Beyond Test Scores Project. Our plan was to study a range of successful American public high schools in order to understand what it looked like and what it took, not just to help students build foundational skills, but to engage them in truly powerful learning. As you might imagine, my own interest in the project was as much personal as academic. I knew that something had been wrong with my teaching, but I didn't know exactly what it was. This gave me an opportunity to find out. Joel and I thought that the project would take us a couple of years. In the end, it took us almost a decade. We visited 30 different schools around the United States, spent more than 750 hours observing classroom instruction, and interviewed more than 350 students, teachers, parents, and administrators. If you want to know all of the things that we learned over the course of this epic journey, you should read our book. It's only 450 pages long. For the time being, though, I want to focus on just one of the things that we learned over the course of our work, which was that the most powerful classrooms had a palpable sense of wholeness to them. This wholeness began with everybody being able to show up as their full and authentic selves. These were classrooms where kids could be quirky and playful and raw, where kids didn't feel that they had to leave behind parts of their identities in order to conform to some arbitrary white-centric notion of what it means to be a good student, where everyone felt that they belonged and had something to offer. As a path to creating this kind of wholeness, the teachers in these classrooms talked freely about themselves and their experiences and often invited their students to do the same. I remember watching in fascination as a high school English teacher talked with his students about his own journey to becoming a Buddhist monk, and then invited his students to talk about their own relationships and non-relationships with faith. You could have heard a pin drop in that classroom while the teacher was talking. And later, when he opened things up for discussion, the students were so engaged that they didn't even notice when the bell rang. The academic content in these classrooms also had a sense of wholeness to it. When I crouched down and asked kids why they were doing what they were doing, they had much better answers than what I usually heard, which was some version of, because the teacher told us to, or because it'll be on the test, or more often than you might imagine, I don't know. These kids weren't analyzing scatter plots because of what shows up on the SAT exam. They were trying to understand the relationship between local economies and rising temperatures. They weren't reading and discussing short stories because they were trying to practice the skill of finding the main idea. They were exploring the notion of platonic love and trying to understand how it differs from romantic love. They weren't writing persuasive essays to work on using rhetorical devices. They were trying out arguments that they planned to use at an upcoming city council meeting. The bad news is that these kinds of classrooms were very hard to find. As it turns out, American public schools, no excuses or not, are often limited in limiting places to spend time. The good news is that all of the schools that Joel and I visited had at least a few classrooms that broke the mold. And over time, it was these classrooms that helped me to understand what had been wrong with my own teaching. My inexperience, my racial biases, and my fragility had combined with the test score-obsessed, deficit-oriented logic of No Child Left Behind and no excuses to prevent me from seeing my students as whole people. I had doubted their capacities. I had negated their identities. I had taught them a few things about reading and writing, but I hadn't dared to believe that we could find a way to be authentic and do authentic work together. At the wise old age of 39, here's something I've learned about mistakes. You can't undo them. Shame and rumination only get you so far. The best option you've got is to apologize, own your impact, and then do better. This is why, in the years since Joel and I wrapped up our work together, I've spent my time trying to act on what I learned about powerful classrooms. What does this look like? Well, as it happens, my job is to run a program that prepares new teachers to work in public schools. Many of my students aren't much older than I was when I began my teaching career, and all of them are asking themselves the same set of questions that faced me back then. Who am I? How do I want to show up in my classroom? How do I want my students to show up in my classroom, and how can I help them do that? What kind of work is worth doing together? Of course, my candidates arrived to my program with smaller questions as well. A lot of smaller questions. How do I write a lesson plan? How do I get the class's attention? What do I do when I ask a question to the class and I get crickets? If our program were to take a no-excuses approach to teacher education, we would focus exclusively on these smaller, more technical questions. We would spend all of our time breaking teaching into its component parts and having our candidates practice over and over again. Get the class's attention. Get the class's attention. Help them find the main idea. Help them find the main idea. But we know too well that this approach would run the risk of creating dehumanizing and fragmented classrooms. And so, as we work with our candidates, we try to make sure that they never lose sight of the whole, even as they practice the parts. We say, oh, you want some help designing some lessons where your students write argumentative paragraphs. That's a great idea. We have a lot of really good resources for that. Before we begin, though, let's talk about the context for your lessons. What are your students writing arguments about? Who are they writing arguments for? How does this task connect to who they are and what they care about and the big questions you want to explore with them? What can you do before and after this set of lessons to create meaning and momentum? In short, we try never to deconstruct teaching without also reconstructing it. We wouldn't want our students or their students to lose the forest for the trees. In our program, we also try to show our candidates what it looks and feels like to be part of a learning community where everyone can show up as their full and authentic selves. At the beginning of the program, we write I am from poems and perform them for each other. And later, we do the same with racial autobiographies. We make class playlists with everybody's favorite music, from Beethoven, which is mine, to Beyonce. We hike and skate and cook together. We apologize to each other when we make mistakes. We hold space for each other in moments of frustration and anger and despair. Perhaps most importantly, in our program, we turn fearlessly toward the topics that schools and teachers too often render undiscussable: racism, sexism, patriarchy, capitalism, colonialism, love, faith, justice. We put all of these things at the front and center of the ongoing conversations that we have with our candidates about what it means to teach and learn and exist. And then we help our candidates figure out what it looks like to do the same for the young people that are in their own classrooms. I sometimes talk about the work of designing and running a teacher prep program as my dream job, and in some ways it is. In other ways, though, it's a form of atonement for me. I don't want any more young people to have to reckon with the damage done by the kind of teaching that I and others imposed on them. And I don't want any more young teachers to have to spend years upon years struggling to find their pedagogical compass. We all deserve better than that. To be fair, there are a few things I've held on to from the era during which I began my teaching career. The belief that teachers must never use race or perceived ability or poverty as reasons to underestimate their students, that's an idea worth holding on to. So too is the belief that schools should treat literacy as a right, not a privilege. And I still believe that teaching requires an immense amount of precision and regularly looking at data. But that's where the connections end. No excuses was a repressive, impoverished, cynical approach to education. What we all need to be working toward is something more responsive, more expansive, more life-giving, and more whole. I know that there are no do-overs. I can never go back to 2005 and try it all again. If I could, though, here's something I might say. Good morning, class. I'm so glad that you're here. Before we start today's lesson, I want you to know that I'm not here to fix you, or to manage you, or to mold you into anything other than the amazing humans that you already are. I'm here because the world is a beautiful and broken place, and I want to keep you company as you try to understand it and navigate it and transform it. You cool with that? Great. Now we can begin. Thank you.